The medieval mace, often seen as an anti-armour weapon. But actually, is the context of these weapons more specifically related, really, only to horsemen? And why would that be? Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria. Now, maces are often described as being an anti-armour weapon, therefore somehow being, and we're going to examine why, being more effective than swords. But first of all, is that actually true? And secondly, if it's not true, a bit of a spoiler alert there, then does that mean that they are really used in another way and for another purpose, for another reason really? So, first thing we have to say is that medieval armour is really difficult to deal with in any capacity on foot or on horseback. By the time we get to the end of the 14th century and right the way through the 15th and into the 16th centuries, armour had developed such that it was incredibly good protection against pretty much all hand weapons, and indeed most missile weapons as well. Being made of hardened spring carbon steel like this, as the best quality armour was, certainly by the 15th century, this can resist arrows, crossbow bolts, swords, maces, axes, even cavalry lances. And helmets like this sallet, or indeed like this great bassinet here, are really, really difficult to get past with any type of handheld weapon. They're made of hardened steel, they're hardened steel lumps, so hitting them with another bit of hardened steel isn't usually going to get through or bypass them enough to injure the person inside. And if you're fully armoured, so in other words a knight or a man-at-arms, you are covered in plate by this time, head to foot, the extremities of your limbs, your hands, your feet, your head, all over you. And really the only gaps, the only major gaps, are going to be filled with mail, or aka chainmail, like this mail collar here of mine. So even if you can get between plates and into so-called chinks or gaps in the plate armour, you still get to get through mail. So just getting into a gap in the apparent armour might not mean that you actually get the person that's underneath, because they've still got this. And let's remember that mail protected people as a sole defence for hundreds of years before plate armour came along. You've got this in most of the major gaps, and there aren't many places where there isn't anything at all. There are a few. So one of those examples is the inside of the hand, and we see techniques in the armoured fighting treatises where you're literally trying to get into the back of the cuff of the gauntlet or the inside of the gauntlet to wound the person through leather, because obviously that's easier than trying to get through mail. One of the other rare examples would be through a slit, for example, which you need in order to be able to see and breathe. So any tiny holes or openings like that are places that you could potentially stab through or into to get to the person inside the armour. And for that reason, swords used half swording, that is to support the blade halfway along usually, or sometimes just used in a conventional grip, either longsword or one-handed sword length, used with the thrusting point in those gaps, is one of the major ways of bypassing armour. So you're not looking to cut through the armour or thrust through the armour, you're looking at really stabbing into gaps, and that's how swords are principally used when fighting on foot. And of course, when fighting on foot, pretty much the most specialised expression of trying to overcome plate harness is the poleaxe, which gives you numerous options, as well as the thrusting spike, which of course you can still use in many of the similar ways to a longsword or arming sword to stab into gaps. But of course you have other hitting options, hammers and spikes, axe blades. Obviously you've got the added leverage of the two-handed weapon, and you even have a back spike on the other end as well. But what about on horseback? Because you can't, generally speaking, use one of these weapons on horseback. So what do you do? Well, that's potentially where we get back to the mace, or perhaps, as we should more correctly term it, the horseman's mace. But before we get fully back to the mace, let's just explain something. On horseback, you're moving, you're on a horse, okay, so it's very different to fighting on foot. Fighting on foot, you're next to your opponent, you can wrestle more easily, you can deploy two-handed weapons like the poleaxe over there more easily. And of course, you know, you're much closer. So for example, you could use daggers during the wrestling and stuff like this. But on horseback, it's a completely different scenario. You're, generally speaking, going to be passing. It's going to be more fluid. There's going to be a little bit more distance because of the width and size of the horses. And obviously you're moving faster than you do on foot in armour. So the nature of the way that you use the weapons are very different. So first of all, the sword. So there are a couple of options with the sword, and the arming sword absolutely, or longsword used in one hand, on horseback was used against armoured people by other armoured people. But your main attack is pretty much always, as on foot, going to be the point. But the difference is you can't really do half swording very easily on horseback because it doesn't have the necessary reach. You could physically do it, you could drop your reins if you're using your reins at all, and you could do half swording, but you're not normally going to be close enough in order to be able to reach another person on a horse. So usually speaking, and we see this in medieval art, the point is usually held out and aimed, for example, at visors or any other openings, back of the armpit if you've gone past someone, with the point of the sword one-handed trying to jab in there. But remember, you've still got to try and get through the mail, although obviously if you're thrusting at the face of the helmet, if your opponent has a helmet on like this, you might be aiming a thrust to try and get it through that vision slit, like that. On horseback, pretty, as well as riding at the same time and trying not to yourself be stabbed, quite a difficult thing to do, but nevertheless that's what you'd try to do. But if you looked at movies or indeed even video games, you might think that on horseback you're usually going to be striking with a sword like this. Well, here's a problem. With a thin, sharp-edged sword rather than a blunt reenactment or tournament sword, one of the problems with striking things like this really, really hard is you're going to break your sword quite often, especially with medieval steel rather than modern nice alloy steels that we have available to us. If you strike your sharp edge into a helmet like this, yes, it will put a scratch in the helmet, but it will also put a ding or, at worst, even a chip in the edge of your blade, which will massively increase the chances of it breaking. And in fact, in medieval art, we see a lot of broken swords. So the problem with plate armour is as soon as you've got huge amounts of plate armour, it makes it very difficult to strike with a sword. So not only do you want to thrust through gaps anyway, but striking with a sword, as well as not really doing anything to the armour, is very likely to break your sword. And so partly for that reason, we often see the mace described as a backup to the sword. The very same people who have arming swords might sometimes leave them on the belt or at the saddle, depending where it's hanging, and instead use the mace because the mace is more durable, or indeed they have used the sword either for thrusting or for giving a blow, and it's broken, it's shivered, and they go to the mace. And one of the great things about the mace is it can't really break. I mean, technically it could, whether it's wooden shaft or metal shaft like this one, but the fact is it's far less likely to break than the sword is. Remember, if you're on horseback, you can't wrestle very easily, you can't deploy daggers very easily, so you're pretty much kind of stuck with fighting at range. And assuming you've used your lance already, if you're using a short hand weapon, then you're going to be striking a lot of the time because that's what you can reach furthest with, unless you're thrusting with a point. And if you're striking into something like this type of weapon is going to, this kind of mace, or indeed a warhammer or similar weapon, is going to be far more durable at smashing into enemy armour and trying to knock them off their horse or daze them or whatever, than trying to do so with a sword. And moreover, it's more effective at it because fundamentally the sword is not a very powerful striking weapon. It cuts through things by virtue of its speed, velocity, and its sharpness, its fineness of blade. That is irrelevant when it comes up against a massive plate helmet like this, because all that's going to happen is when the light, fast-moving object meets the heavy and very unbreakable object, the light object is likely to break on it, and it's going to have no effect, or almost no effect, on the person inside. Strikes from this sword will barely be felt inside this helmet. However, a top-heavy, hammer-like, almost indestructible weapon, you're more likely to feel it. I'm not going to say it's necessarily going to knock you out or anything like that. However, people like my friend Dequitem, for example, have been hit in the helmet with maces, and it's not pleasant. It's not very nice. Being hit in the head with a sword, less of a problem. So these top-heavy weapons, they're not necessarily going to compromise the helmet, but they're going to have more percussive effect than a sword would. So I think it's completely fair to say, yes, these have more percussive force against armour, and almost certainly when these started to get popular in the 13th century for use against people wearing great helms and mail armour, chainmail all over their bodies, these would have been given blows into the body and would have had a good amount of effect through the mail. You can't, generally speaking, cut through mail with a sword, but you can hit someone really hard with a top-heavy object like this or an axe, and you can break their bones, their ribs, or their collarbones or whatever underneath anyway, which a sword might not necessarily do, and the sword's more likely to break. So, a couple of important points here. One, yes, this has slightly more percussive effect through the armour than this does, but I believe even more importantly, and backed up by the period evidence of these often being backup weapons to these, including incidentally by the Ottoman Turks, these are more durable. So if you're having to hit people who are fully encased in steel armour, these are very often going to break. The sharp versions of these are very often going to break, when a mace very rarely will break against armour, which means you can keep using it both offensively and defensively. Okay, and it's better to have a weapon that has some effect on the target but doesn't break, versus a weapon which has some effect on the target but does break. Finally, why horsemen? Why not on foot? So, not saying that these were never used on foot. I'll just put the sword down for a second. These were sometimes used on foot. We see them in period art being carried by people on foot and sometimes being used on foot. But fundamentally, if you're on foot, you're better off using a two-handed weapon. This is always going to be a better choice on foot than this. It's got all of the leverage and reach and every other defensive and offensive advantage over the mace. Far more effective on foot because you can use it on foot. If you're on foot, why use that when you can use that? That's the most important point. But additionally, on horseback, that's pretty easy to carry. This is really convenient. They're usually hung off the saddle bow one way or another. They can sometimes have a ring. So they sometimes go that way around, sometimes via a ring that way around. They can hang off your belt or your saddle ring. They're always there. They're easy to grab hold of as a backup or in a pinch. So they're convenient to carry. You can't carry a poleaxe when you're on horseback. But perhaps equally importantly, this being a top-heavy weapon means that it adds the force of your horse when you're moving, whether you're hitting someone down low who's on foot or another horseman up here. It has a top-heavy effect which is added to by the speed and momentum of your horse. So this becomes a more potent weapon on horseback than it would be if I'm just swinging it at someone. Not to say it's not effective also on foot, but on horseback way more effective because of the momentum of the horse. Finally, I would say if you can't have a poleaxe on foot, this is a better weapon than this on foot, because as mentioned, the best way of taking out an armoured opponent isn't hitting them, it's stabbing them in a gap. And this is always going to be better at that, obviously, than a mace would be. Anyway, thanks a lot for watching. I have been Matt Easton. I'll continue to be. Make sure you're subscribed and I'll see you back on the channel really soon. Cheers, folks.